We are live as of, it says 3 seconds. So we're back for another episode of Beard Banter. And I actually have the pleasure of sitting with Mr. Ryan Weeks, the surfing CISO. I modified my title to state my surfing status. It is certainly less surfing and more falling, but that's okay. So the intention today is, Ryan Weeks is a CISO at a company that I love, and has, we had this post, and somebody was posting about, basic security in the engineering cycle, security in, the development life cycle. And I got this massive post from Ryan, right? Like, he responded with some serious passion and a lot of really raw data. And it kind of told me that, Ryan has a passion towards this. And then he and I jumped on a call to kind of discuss, and it led me down this path of kind of understanding his, iterative attempts at this and trying to integrate security and trying to integrate these processes that allow, what really the post was about was around saying, hey, if I find a flaw internally or through some vulnerability disclosure program or whatever it may be, how do I slipstream that in with development for all the other things? It's this concept of technical debt. And so I want to let Ryan kind of introduce himself and kind of talk about where he comes from, but that's kind of what set the stage for today. And then we're going to be talking about really, how do you bring engineering and security in the same CI/CD direction, the same way that they're heading, in the pipeline for code. And there's a lot of challenges to that. So go ahead, Ryan, if you'll introduce yourself, and then we'll just kind of go through it.
I have to resist the urge to jump straight into the topic because
Yeah.
it is something I am very passionate about. But yeah, for those of you that don't know me, Ryan Weeks, CISO at Datto, been with the company for 5 years actually, come Monday. So
Congratulations.
Feel like a veteran now in the channel, especially through all we've been through in terms of cybersecurity in the past 5 years. But came to Datto via financial services at a fintech company.
That's awesome.
So yeah,
I have a history in banking and had my Series 7 and 66 LHVA. So kind of similar to Wes Spencer, right? Come from that fintech and/or financial background.
It's a great proving ground. It's a great place to learn a lot of really high quality stuff. So, and it really has been a privilege to bring that knowledge to bear for MSPs in the MSP space.
Well, and for anybody not listening, the reason that the fintech comes this way is it's probably one of the really early, highly regulated, highly delineated around technology security, around financial technology security. It's the first place people thought. Yeah, and it was highly targeted, right? So, being in a financial background, for anybody that's listening that's in that kind of ELI 5 stage, it gives you a lot more maturity around some of the things it takes to develop security operations. Yeah. Just my opinion. So
yeah, the regulation and the funding tend to follow the targeting. So I think that in the MSP IT channel space, right, we've been being targeted for, you could say 2 years, 3 years, but it's been a little bit longer than that. Actually, you can trace it back. If you really want to go back, you can trace it back to 2014 when APT
with APT 49. Oh, 10. Yeah.
APT 10 compromising MSPs that were in charge of hotels in order to conduct cyber espionage activities. So, but the real play is kind of the past few years. So I think we're going through those growing pains of highly targeted industry and, kind of Wes, you, me, we've been there, done that, seen that. Yeah. So fun to ride that wave again. To keep the surfing analogy going.
Yeah, fair. And it's a big wave, right? Like, and I think to your point, you kind of touched on something, is that we're starting to see this come into the MSP as an attack surface. We're starting to see it talked about. I think it's more that we're starting to see it be publicized, right? I think is your point. If you look back at the nation state players that were breaching large MSPs for espionage reasons and that kind of statement, but we're starting to see it. Now it's ransomware. Now it's extortion. Now it's very public to the client. Now it's very much in your face. And I think that's kind of what is driving this renaissance of this giant tsunami. See, back to the whole surf. I mean, that would be a hard thing to surf, like a tsunami, but I still wanted to throw it in there.
I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah.
And I think, again, I fear that I'm making it sound like it's MSPs that are being targeted. I tend to think of it as the IT channel as being targeted, and that includes
Agreed.
SMBs, MSPs, and vendors.
And enterprise to some extent still too, right? I mean, if
Yeah,
you
I
look
mean,
at it, but
anybody
yeah.
that has anything to do with that ecosystem, that's a supply chain to that ecosystem. Like it all starts with SMBs and MSPs, and it goes from there.
Yep.
So, but yeah,
Yeah.
so my background has been in kind of building. I started off my career as like a firewall administrator and network engineer, and found myself in a position where I kept pointing out things that were wrong, and people kept saying, "Okay, go fix it." And then you fix it, and next thing you know, you're running a security program at a global financial company, and then Datto comes knocking on your door, and you can't say no. And here I am, 5 years later, honestly, still having fun. So I think that's
Yeah.
the most important piece. You got to enjoy what you do.
Yeah, I'm quite passionate about security myself and education, so it
You don't
makes it fun for
say.
me. Yeah, it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe. But on the discussion that's bringing us right to the point, one of the challenges that came up was Matt Lee, as a security researcher or an internal asset inside Datto, comes in and says, "I see a giant flaw in our authentication system that needs to be dealt with." You do some analysis. That analysis says, hey, that's going to take up 30% of my resources for the foreseeable quarter to solve this. That's the picture. Let's just pretend like we're at that virgin and perfect state. And I think that being said, that's kind of what you were talking about, how you saw this being solved, right? And your vision and mission of how that would be solved. And correct me if
Yeah,
I've set the stage wrong, but that's the way I would see the problem that's been presented in front of many
yeah.
up here.
That's the classic kind of go-to example about why software security is hard, because you get these vulnerabilities that are like, oh man, that's going to require us to completely re-architect our platform.
Right.
What do we do with that?
Yeah.
The other problem I've always had with vulnerabilities is we when you focus on vulnerabilities are a binary state. They either exist or they don't exist. But you have to think about them in terms of risk, because risk has more variation, shades of gray, right?
Sure.
And so in an instance where you can't necessarily mitigate a vulnerability, you can reduce the risk, which is the likelihood or the exposure to a threat
Yeah, the
actor.
blast
And it's
radius or the chance of
right.
occurrence, right?
So
Those
there's
those
always
sides of
things
it.
you can do, like even if you can't like completely clear it off the books, maybe it takes 30 weeks of work to clear it off the books. In those instances, you got to ask yourself, is it worth it relative to all the other security debt that exists? And can we do something in the interim that reduces it? So I both love and hate that example, because it's normally the one that people kind of go to talk about why new approaches to solving security debt won't work because of this edge case. And
Sure. Well, help me with a
and
better centrist case then. So help me
yeah,
give an example of a very central kind of case. And the edge case I get. And I agree that's somewhat of a hyperbolous edge case, right? In the sense of
yeah,
the Mameas of the world, that kind of definition. But they
yeah,
get built by having legacy dependencies, and they get built by having these legacy architectures that don't get kind of refreshed in part of the view. So help me with a better
yeah.
example that's not so hyperbolous then.
Yeah, I mean, you're always gonna struggle with those cases. Those will always
Sure.
exist. The challenge is how do you handle them? Do you let those examples be the thing that prevents you from implementing something that would be effective for the other 90% vulnerabilities that don't fall into that case? And that's the problem I have with that example is 90% of vulnerabilities can be fixed relatively quickly. And I
Okay.
say that with confidence because I'm in my own program, like we measure um, how quickly we can work through vulnerabilities. Well, kind of fast forward. I'll walk you through all the things I did and failed at in order to get to
Those
this
are my
point.
favorite. But yeah,
Yeah,
I do like the solution too.
that's where you learn. But where we ultimately got to was um, we have a set of objectives that are performance managed, that are owned by engineering to
Nice. That's a
mitigate
critical piece.
vulnerability. And the vulnerability doesn't say the objective doesn't say 100% of vulnerabilities will be mitigated. It actually says 90%, because I need to leave room for that 10% that don't fit into that standard mitigation SLA. And so what we have is, I call it a deferral process. And so you can come to me and my CTO and the senior leaders of engineering, and you can put forth a case about why a vulnerability is going to take longer to mitigate and what you can do in the interim to reduce it that might be quicker than the ultimate fix. And then as a team, we review those and we authorize them. We give you an amount of time that you're willing to operate with that vulnerability. But that deferral comes with an agreement that you will immediately start working on the long-term fix, even though it might take you 3 months instead of 1 month, because there's a substantial architectural change. But like, you have to leave room for those hard ones. Otherwise, you make it impossible to solve the 90% of the ones that aren't hard.
I think you hit something really huge right there, right? In the sense that it has to come with comma space, the statement that you're also working on the fix, the long-term fix, right? Because what you're basically saying is, yes, you can chew that chewing gum up and stick it in the hole in the dam, but you damn well better have the concrete people behind you to start figuring out how we're going to actually architecturally support this long-term.
Yeah.
And I think so many companies never come back from the gum in the wall, right? They're like, it hasn't leaked again. It's holding. I'm good. Like,
here's the really cool thing, right? We designed this objective. So we've operated with the objective for 2 years. We're going into our third year with it. We designed the objective that you can defer % of your vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Just to remove the argument and to make it psychologically safe for engineering managers to sign on to SLAs for vulnerability remediation.
I see.
Do you know how often they actually defer?
What's the percentage?
I can count them on one hand.
It's an infinitesimally small.
This is why I say I really don't like that argument, because it's a philosophical argument. It's not a practical argument. Like, yeah, there's a handful of issues each year where I look at them and I'm like, oh yeah, that is going to be really hard to solve. And like, in the meantime, we can make this change in the application layer that reduces the likelihood of that issue, or we can deploy some other compensating control, or we can do something to reduce the risk of that. So that's great. But yeah, the biggest thing is, like, if you're going to hold people's feet to the fire in terms of managing vulnerabilities, one, you have to make, I like to think of it in terms of a RACI matrix. And one of the ways we actually got to this final state is probably after the third or fourth time I was in my career, not just at Datto, where I had failed to implement something that was leading to the we went back to RACI matrices. So for those who don't know what RACI is, it's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And you have to bucket who that's involved in a given process fits into which of those buckets. And what we found is that there were multiple people that were responsible and accountable for the outcome. And the number one rule with RACI is you cannot have multiple responsible or accountable parties. And the reason that this is, and this is where your post got me triggered, right? Was there was this conversation about this dichotomy between product and engineering. Who's the person deciding what work goes into what sprint? And that's when I was like, that's exactly what's wrong. You can't have two people responsible, because people are looking at engineers and like, well, why didn't you fix the thing? You don't need a product person to tell you. And they're like, well, actually I do, because they control 100% of what I work on. And so now security people got to go beg product people, but they're like, yeah, but the sales guy wants me to load this new feature on the truck. So like, go talk to so now I'm talking to the sales guy about needing to fix security debt. Like, that's totally broken. So you have to break that apart. You have to say product people and
tell me how prevalent is that in software development? Because I've been involved in a lot of advisory board, and it almost seems like there's always a dichotomy between
every place I've always been has this problem, right?
Yeah.
And so my first foray, the first application security team I owned, we actually tried multiple things again that failed. One was to disclose every vulnerability as a risk.
Okay.
Which means it has likelihoods and impacts, and there's a lot more
data.
So
you just straight quantify it, right? So you just say this is 1,000, not 700.
But it just became it became a mountain of data that was difficult, and it wasn't leading to materially better outcomes.
Sure.
So then what you did is you would basically just go beg the engineers to fix it. And the engineers would fix like 70% of the vulnerability. And then you'd measure that long tail of that other 30%. And we actually
As your
found that
titration,
if it didn't get fixed in the first 30 days of being found, the likelihood that would be open for 2 or more years was closer to 90%.
Oh, wow.
So there's an incredibly
Just kind of a
long,
forget it pile? Is that kind of the
it's like,
conversation
oh,
that
it's too
happens?
hard. It's a
Yeah.
theoretical thing. And so
Yep.
one of my favorite exercises to do, maybe you can put your red light on here.
Yeah, man.
My pen test team, I love having them go in and look at backlogs of stale issues that aren't being fixed.
Yeah.
And we'll actually do pen tests, which is
Using those enumerations, like
just
using
take the
those
vulnerabilities
pieces.
we know about. How can you chain them together to have a really catastrophic outcome?
An RCE or something massive or whatever. Yeah.
Not every CV, sometimes 3 mediums are far worse than a CVSS 9.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of interesting things that you can do to kind of get traction with those backlogs, but those things only work to a point. Ultimately, where you have to get to is you have to have one responsible party, right? Engineering. And then what you need to do is you need to help them carve out resource to work on the problem, because they're still stuck with someone else determining where they spend their time.
Yeah.
And so that was the next big epiphany for us was, okay, now we're going to give them this goal. We gave them the goal initially just and said, see how close you can come. We're not going to performance
to the 90, to the non-deferred side. Yeah.
Yeah. Just see how close you can get to it. A lot of them did really well, but the ones that didn't were just completely strapped for resource. And so there we started putting in security champions. We'd hire a software engineer, one person, just to work on security related mitigations, whether it's vulnerabilities, third-party disclosures, internal pen test findings, risks, architectural findings, whatever it is, wherever it comes from, one person. And the one person in every team, I mean, that's all it took. All it took is one person.
Because you could cross over teams for collaboration to meet certain things. Like if you have this architectural challenge that needs multiple pieces and parties.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, let's say I had a product and it had 50 vulnerabilities in its backlog. If I have one person whose only job is to clear that backlog out and they have an entire year to do it, and no one else is clamoring for their time, that backlog gets paid down. And it just takes investing in one resource that's kind of cordoned off. But what we found is you hire that one resource, then they get stuff put into the sprints by the engineering managers that's just for them. So they're still using the sprint process, but now you've created that dedicated lane. Yeah. And every once in a while, when you have a really hard one,
and you've brought your responsibility, allow me to break in, and you've brought your responsibility to that one engineering manager, and this is the threaded advisor that's waiting on the next ability to do work in that sprint, right? Because they're waiting on some dependency or they're waiting on some architecture delineation. Yeah, that's smart. You create the voice inside the org that's within the responsibility party.
Yes, and because they're working in the sprint teams, you're starting to create a culture of security and understanding. They're seeing what else is going into the sprint, so they're helping make sure that things are being done in a secure way. And now when they raise their hand and they're like, hey, I got a hard one, I need some help fixing this one, we're finding that machine is just working really well. But
gathering momentum.
I've tried it 100 ways and failed. Like I call it it's like a grail quest, right? Like I've been in this field for 20 years, and it wasn't until this last iteration that we finally got it right.
The one that you're on 2 years of active function in.
At Datto. Now that doesn't mean that periodically we don't miss SLAs.
Sure.
We do, right? For various different reasons. But I got to tell you, I've never had a machine that works quite as well as the one we have now. But I went through the go beg the product manager, work around the product manager and
incentivize the product manager for a certain percentage of backlog
just to be clear, I'm not throwing shade at product managers.
There
are some product managers that do really understand the importance of security, and
Well, it's not their
They
fault. They're not measured on it. They're measured on feature
right,
set release. They're measured
right,
on next net new, signer from, where I first experienced this, and I won't name the company, but I was working on replacing a certain type of physical widget that every company always has, right? So I was working on this particular piece of equipment, and as we needed to replace it, we're seeing that there were some real gaps in the authentication process for this company, the way that their cloud tied together to their single sign-on, their role-based access control. They had a lot of legacy debt there. And so as we were talking about it, my MVP for us to bring all of these widgets over, and this was hundreds and hundreds of these very expensive widgets, and as we were negotiating to bring those over, they asked me, well, how many widgets are you going to buy if we fix these giant problems that we know are tech debt? We know those are things where I'm using some old architecture. I'm still using an ADFS instead of some third-party Okta, or right. I'm starting to show this kind of age of my investment. And so those are the other things where there's not distinct vulnerabilities. They're just old architecture. They're just tech debt that's something you invested in, so I'm not going to work on it. And so as I
yeah,
asked for that to be fixed, they wanted me to prove how many I was going to buy, and they wrote it down. And I said, well, are you ever going to hold me to that? Well, no. Well, then why are you writing it down? Well, I can't win this fight unless this has more revenue than this other MSP that's signing this other thing, and they want this feature, and that's what we're going to do. So, like, back to your point, that's what triggered me on this. It was like being told that even though everybody knows this, everybody in the department understands this risk exists. Everybody know it's just that ugly
yeah.
sister that we don't talk about.
Yeah,
Just
to me that's a failure. Like that conversation has a place in a product organization, but it's usually when you're talking about entering a new market, right? Is the
okay,
cost to implement the feature or functionality that's necessary to enter the new market justified by the revenue opportunity? It's an
right,
opportunity cost conversation, right?
right,
When you start to apply that to like, should we fix this security issue or not? That's a sign that your process is fundamentally broken. What I would say is in those cases where um, you have those, the how many people are asking for it, or what's the revenue associated with it,
yeah,
the that really becomes a risk conversation. What's the risk of
right,
not having this this feature, or what's the risk of not having a control to compensate for whatever weaknesses exists?
yeah.
And that is really where you need to shift that to a risk conversation, because it's not really, if you're
Which,
not getting traction on the vulnerability, then what's happening is you're accumulating vulnerability.
yep,
The amount of
and risk,
vulnerability becomes quantifiable,
right,
and then you can really start to measure risk. What's the likelihood in a 3-year period that we're going to have a loss that's going to exceed $2 million because we don't fix this? If the cost of the control is 3 weeks worth of engineering work, you bring that forward to someone and say, would you take 3 weeks out of your sprint cycles to fix a vulnerability that guarantees we avoid a $2 million loss that's likely to occur in the next 3
yep.
years? Hands down, like any reasonable person looks at that and says, yes, I will do that. But that takes more work. And that's why you got to
Which is
shift
back to your
more of that.
risk-based model that you were talking
Right.
about, where you used to quantify them and come up with some round number,
Yeah.
and that's what you were
But
talking
that's
about
the
doesn't
rare
function.
case. That's the exceptional case. You can't do that for every vulnerability. You need a process that just
That
works.
just in line, in thread brings them in,
Yeah.
right? That it's just part
Yeah.
of that's
Yeah.
part of the
This
process.
there's two things to think about here too, right? Like a lot of people still probably don't think about this, but because I've studied this problem so much, you really have two mountains of debt. One
Okay.
is net new vulnerabilities that come in from pen tests and disclosures, and your own engineers finding things, your customers finding things. That's kind of new vulnerability debt. Then you have existing vulnerability debt, the stuff that's already in the backlog that's sitting there that's stale. And so when we introduced the objective initially, I said, let's do a backlog review. Anything
Okay.
that's really serious, I'm going to ask you to fix.
Right.
And we did that. There was only a handful of things we really pulled off. And I said, okay, so to start, and again, this is going back a couple of years, I
Sure.
just want you to fix new vulnerabilities within these timeframes. And they were
Right.
like,
At least don't
oh,
add to my mountain, right? Like,
yes,
at
let's
least
stop. I
let's get
call
it
it
to where we
stop the
are stop the
bleeding.
bleeding. Yeah, exactly.
Stop.
So
I always
100%.
call it stop the bleeding. Like job one when you're introducing a new process
Yeah.
to fix something that's broken is
Cauterize
to stop the
first.
bleeding,
Yeah,
right?
I'm with you.
And so once we got success with that, I was like, look, you can do this. I was like, And not only can you do this, like there are 2 or 3 sprint cycles where you're not doing any security related work. So
Yeah.
this isn't
Yeah.
as big a problem as you thought it was. What I want you to do is any sprint where you don't have a new vulnerability, I want you to pull 1 or 2 off the
One
backlog
off
and
the
fix them.
pile. Sure.
Just pull 1,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And then
How long
ultimately
did
what
it
you do
take you to
is,
get to perdition? With you having 99%, right? Like you said, of that
yeah.
actually staying in house and getting done. So the 1% deferral rate at max, right? How long did it take you to chew through the pile? Like even if there was only X handful of them,
Some
did it go pretty quick? Did it escalate?
some teams have bigger and harder debt than others, so you really have to
Okay.
measure it on a team by team basis. Um,
Okay.
but what I'll say is, in the past 2 years, I would say 90% of our products are down to single digit vulnerability
Oh,
backlogs.
that's awesome.
But
Yeah.
the reason we also got there is because what we did is we started to use these 2 piles in an interesting way. What I said is, if you don't fix a new vulnerability within your SLA, we're going to consider it an old vulnerability. And you also have a counter objective that says your backlog will not grow.
That was the question
So,
I was going to try to
so if you're going
touch,
to dump
right?
something off your new stack to your old stack, you're going to
Your
have to pay off
backlog better be
something
dropped
else.
off something else. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So
Totally.
you're always balancing these 2 things, but you have to start with stopping the bleeding, and then you have to work in this construct of paying it down. And again, you have to resource the teams. And I'm not saying, some people think you have to build like entire sprint teams of 6 people. And I'm
Which
like,
was what I started to write of, you just have a dedicated sprint team towards,
yeah,
one
you
of the
just need one
triggering
person.
statements, right? Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
hire one person and stick them into a sprint team and tell them the only thing you work on is what we
You know,
call,
what you're really talking about though is injecting culture, Ryan. Like, I mean, whether
it
you've done
is.
it in some systemic way and injecting a human that already has a security focus, that even if they only have one eye to focus with it, they're security focused, right? Sorry, a little self
Yeah.
dig, but the point is, like, you're injecting that culture, right? You're bringing in a person that's going to be that voice. I used to tell people I have a 1-string guitar. I have a lot of 1-string guitars, but I play a 1-string guitar a lot, right? Of different notes. And so, I tell people that, and yours would be a ukulele to stay in the very Hawaiian
Yes.
theme.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But you play this guitar as that DevSecOps member that came in as a security focus, that, you, like you said, you kind of born into that space. But as they kept growing, you already described the culture shift. You already described I now have help from my peers. It already naturally happens. Even though I've been brought in as the security person, there's already these other people doing it. Like, you've really just described a matrix to shift the culture of a development team,
Yeah.
not just the actual structure of
Yeah.
how they're
Like, listen,
incentivized.
I'm not the guy that invented the idea of a decentralized software security group and security champions. Um,
Oh, I love them.
People that are
Yeah.
smarter than me kind of brought that model, and I was like, that. I have this motto with my team: you can give up when you have literally tried everything you and everyone else can think of to solve the problem. And so, as you can imagine, that's a pretty high
And
bar to
everyone
get me
else you
up.
can think of is a very large
Yeah.
barrier to entry.
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
and so they brought this to me, and I was like, yeah, we haven't tried that. Let's try that. Like, let's make a case. We took it to our executive team. We took it ultimately up to our board of directors and said, this is something that we need to invest in order to keep Datto safe for us and for our customers. And they bought in, and we went, we hired those heads, and we
Yeah.
did it, and it's working. Again, it's not perfect. And I'm
No.
not saying that this is even going to work other places, but the thing that I think that we need to really realize is, if you're doing something and it's not working, it's okay to label it as something that didn't work and iterate and
Yeah.
try something else. Like, you have
Yeah.
to keep trying until you get to a point where you're like, this is a satisfactory outcome.
Yep.
And
Agreed.
I'll tell you, like, this year we just kind of communicated the success of the last year's objective out to all the orgs.
Yeah,
We
your
had,
spider diagram you showed me.
yeah, well, that's a different
Oh, okay.
objective that
Sorry.
the security champions helped
Yeah.
with. But how they achieved their vulnerability management objectives, we had one team that missed. They hit, like, I think it was like 70% instead of 90.
Okay.
Um,
Were
and
those ones that also correlatedly had the larger mountain of debt and the harder
they
debt
have
to
the
solve
larger
too?
mountain of
Yeah.
debt,
Yeah.
and those were the ones where the security champions didn't get hired until Q4 of last year.
Okay.
So what does
So you
that
could,
tells
it's almost
you?
proof of the culture injection
It
and then
is. It's
separation and
proof, like,
focus, right? Like,
once,
that's your
but even
control group.
still, 70% without
Yeah, it's still
any,
huge.
just holding them to the objective without any help like,
Yep.
how can you call that a failure when 2 years ago, like, it was like, yeah, just put it on the pile, like, no one cares, just, whatever, you
You
know?
know,
Um,
it makes me think too, because if you don't cheat the system, right? What I mean by that is once you have this kind of flexing muscle in your arm, and we've got security built into the day to day, at least in the DevSecOps aspect of this, right? And how we do it. When you start looking at that, and you now are willing to bring in people that have vulnerabilities, and you're willing to look at these other vulnerabilities that might be outside of your normal purview. Maybe it's dependencies, Log4j for an example, or maybe someone else is using Log4j that's not even in my system, and it might still have create some. And so you start getting into these like data flow dependencies and challenges. Like, as long as you're not cheating that system and you're doing that and you can show that work, what we're trying to meet, and I think that what MSPs that are listening, vendors that are listening that develop code, you're really just trying to meet the reasonable person rule right now. Like, you're really just being able to try to explain to 12 peers that barely understand the technology we're talking about how you did what any reasonable person would do. Well, if you can show two stories, one in which you have a mountain of tech debt that you were aware of for forever and you had no process to iterate through and you had no cadence to understand you were measuring it, no methodologies to make sure you're fixing it, compared to I have a team. I inject these security professionals. We worked through this mountain of debt. We got better at it this year. We now showed that we improved on how we bring in more vulnerabilities, which that is reasonable person rule right now. That is this iterative proof that we are improving over time. We all suck at this. Like, in reality, you have an uneducated consumer, an uneducated creator, and a huge mountain of risk that we were all unaware of. Like, really, if we look at that from a massive perspective like that, it is a mountain of risk that we all own and we're all waking up to. And I think showing how well you start to move those legs and flex those muscles is probably the single most important thing you can do as a company right now. And so, like, that's kind of what excites me about showing that iterative improvement you talk about, right? Your statement of you can't be afraid to mark something that didn't work. It didn't work. So many people have policies that say, yeah, I've got this policy. Yeah, but you knew it didn't work.
yeah.
It didn't work and you knew it,
Or,
right? Like,
or you were okay with the fact that it wasn't working, which is,
right. Even worse in some ways.
that's the sign. And like, I go back to, a conversation we had last summer with John Strand, and I asked him on the cyber call, I asked him, how would an MSP know what good application security looks like? And his answer was brilliant, and I totally didn't expect it. It was anyone that takes application security seriously, it gets really excited about it and is willing to talk to you for hours about it. Like,
Yeah.
thus, I take time out of my day to write a ridiculously long reply.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, and are nerding out on this right now for an
Yeah,
hour.
and but I think part of what I want to do here too is like show MSPs, give you a little bit of like context around the problems, and like get you a little bit smarter about the challenges that your vendors are facing, and then give them like, be like, do you guys have security champions? How do the security champions operate? Who gives
Tell
them
me about
the
your
work?
security work in your
Yeah.
development team recently. If they can't answer that question,
Yeah.
and with some degree of passion or understanding
Yeah.
of why it matters, then I think
Yeah.
that's where I'd be terrified.
What percentage of your sprints are dedicated to paying down security debt?
Yeah.
Like, again, like,
Imagine if I asked you that question, Ryan, and your answer was, man, it's not that simple. Let me explain to you how we actually do it. Or mine would be blown,
Yeah.
right? Like, I'd be like, yeah, that's amazing. You're tying it into the day to day. It's now become not security. It's not the security team down on you. It's this is what our responsibility is. We put it as part of our code, just like putting pre-stress in our concrete when we lay a road, right? If we don't do that, the product isn't finished. I mean, it's brilliant.
Yeah, and I mean, just to be fair, like, I don't know that I could give you a percentage, but I can tell you there's one person in every single sprint team that is focused on security.
Yeah.
And that is proven in the numbers to be more than enough. Now, if we get to a point where, I don't know, maybe something happens and, we just made a dumb architectural decision, created a bunch of flaws.
Right.
We got to pay that down. Maybe that's the type of thing where we swarm and we say, you know what, we're gonna take a month and all we're gonna do is pay that down, or we're gonna hire a second
this
champion.
First part of the quarter. Yeah, we're only doing this.
But like, we've created this really solid framework to measure how we're doing and when we need more resource, and like that willingness to do that. And like you were noting the spider chart, like ultimately we wound up doing is, after we got the vulnerability stuff under control, a lot of these security champions were like, hey, we could get better at this and we could do this. And like, we could prevent even creating these vulnerabilities.
Yes.
This thing.
Yeah.
And
Self-healing to some
that's
extent.
ultimately what led us down this road of the building security and maturity model and getting compliance with it. And
Yeah.
I showed Matt a spider graph that shows kind of where the assessors found us to have really high capability in areas that we still need to work. And a lot of our stuff was kind of design patterns, architectural review, and so we have an architect. We've had an architect hire that we've been trying to hire for 6 months. It's a really hard role to fill, but we finally have a hire that should be starting in a couple weeks. And so the cool thing is, even before the assessment was done, we had already identified that and been recruiting for that improvement because of the work we
It's
were
the
doing with our
6
security
months.
champions.
Yeah,
And they
of
were like,
trying this.
"Hey, we need more threat modeling. Hey, where's the design pattern for this? Like, hey, is there a component that's already built that I can use to do this thing securely?" And it was pushing us in that direction of needing to kind of do that, hire that dedicated security architect. So
we've got a question from Martin's, a friend of mine, also another software code producer, right? A company that's developing product for the MSP channel. He says, is that one security focused person, the sprint, especially trained in software security, or are they interchangeable with other software devs, right? In the sense of they, and I want to poke at this real quick before you answer, because I need to know your answer. But for me, Martin, it's always been the person that's passionate about it before the person that's trained about it. And it's always been the person that's going to go carry that torch and look as dumb as MSP is, and be that guy that's just fighting for security internally, because the skills and capabilities have to be borne by everyone at some point, in my opinion. But go ahead and if you will, you could touch on that one.
Yeah. So I think Matt really summed it up well. There are areas where you're going to hire for passion, and there's areas you're going to hire for talent. So in our software security initiative, we kind of have this concept of like a lead security champion. Those people tend to have experience. They've done kind of the software security role somewhere else. And there might be areas where you find someone that has a really high aptitude for security, is just a sponge in their ability to learn and absorb. And so what we've actually done is part of a benefit of becoming a security champion, because we didn't just hire security champions. In some teams, we actually asked for people to volunteer. So we might say,
that's awesome.
So rather than because sometimes it's easier to hire a net new, lower entry level software engineer. So if you can get a mid-level software engineer to raise their hand
that already knows the code to some extent, that already knows some of the weaknesses.
I want to be a security champion. Can you train me? I will take that all day long. And then you backfill that role with an entry-level software engineer to kind of displace what they had been working on. That's worked out really well for us too, that promotion within.
Because then they're a guide for the code as that person's being trained, but also they're learning.
So a benefit of being a security champion at Datto is that I actually have dedicated budget to train and to allow my security champions to go get certifications.
Oh, that's epic. Nice.
So it's a continuing educational professional development benefit. Not only are you helping to improve it, but we're going to invest back in your career.
That's awesome.
That to me. So I talked to so I have kind of people that have worked for me in the past that went on to work at Google and LinkedIn and Salesforce and Tumblr and Twitter and all those. And so I reached out to them and I'm like, hey, talk to me about your security champion program. Why would anybody do that? What's in it for them? And I kind of learned from them. And then the biggest thing that I heard with all of them is you have to invest back into the champions if you want that program to be successful.
Yeah, they've got to have a legitimacy. They have to have a legitimizer that says, do you know what you're talking about?
You know what? We're going to train you and we're going to help you get accreditation and certification. But we've been lucky that we've been able to hire some that already come with that. But there's just this ongoing commitment to continuing education for them, and that's great. So
that's huge, and it shows you care, right? It's the age-old adage: "What if I invest in them and they leave, or what if you don't and they stay?" Right? But I will say there's a very important question everybody's dying to know. Give me a rating. Are you a decent surfer? You're still alive, so you have to be a decent surfer enough.
I will say I'm a good beginner surfer. I can catch a wave by myself. I can hit a turn. But I'm not surfing any major swells. I'm
with this belly, I'm much more of a floater myself.
I'm probably sticking to 3 or 4 foot waves right now. Then, I mean, honestly, it's a matter of I just don't get to do it that often. I'm living in the Northeast, so
that's awesome.
But any chance I get,
Do you
take
care
it.
if it's a white sand beach, or would you prefer, brown sand beaches?
I mean, a wave's a wave, man. I don't really care. The
You
beach
don't
has
care what
nothing to do
sand's
with it.
being ground into your face when you finish up your surfing,
No,
or is that not your normal
no.
occurrence?
The only
Okay,
criteria is that I'm not going to get shredded by a reef. But when you're
fair,
surfing
fair.
like 3 foot, 4 foot waves, you don't tend to have a problem with that. You're not
That's
getting
true. Yeah,
tumbled too
yeah,
hard.
yeah. You
So
might get rolled a little
um,
bit, but that's about it. Yeah. So
yeah, it was funny. I was took a break with my wife at my last company. Went to Costa Rica, and I think it's Tamarindo as kind of a surf town. You could get like, it's funny. They give you like a taco, a surfboard, and a rash guard for like $30, and you get like a 2 hour lesson. And so I was
sure.
like, this thing, I'll try anything once. And I went there. I caught my first wave. I was absolutely hooked. Like,
Oh wow.
totally fell in love with
That's
it.
where it
And
started for you. Essentially, was the first
yeah,
time surfing ever? Was
yeah.
that
And
the
now it's like
rash guard and a sandwich, and it's time to move forward kind of
yeah,
thing?
now it's a criteria. Like, we're gonna go away. I always ask my
That's
wife,
awesome.
do you know if there's any good surfing near there?
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, it's the one thing I want to do when I'm not cybering. I want to be surfing. So
I grew up in Pensacola, Florida, so it's one of those things where that was a major part of it. Ron John Surf Shop was right there, and
you would think
yeah,
you'd be a
yeah.
better surfer.
No, there's a body shape conversation that gets involved, along with some depth perception and balance challenges. God has a sense of humor, but
Yes. Yeah.
we only have a few minutes left, and so I want to touch it off with this. Shiva had popped in there and just kind of was, asking, and you don't have to answer this, but he says, listen, is Datto part of a vulnerability disclosure program? And I don't leave off the aspect of like DIVD, just I know that's kind of a new thing that's kind of being kicked around, but it's really this part of back to what I was saying. As long as you don't cheat the
Yeah.
incoming aspect of adding vulnerabilities to the queue, so that you're not cheating it artificially. Do you guys have a mature VDP internally, externally, or otherwise? And I think the answer is yes. I've read it. So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah. So we've had a VDP for 4 years.
that's
It's
awesome.
been formally documented for at least 2.
Okay.
You could literally search VDP in
And no
Datto.
VDP is perfect, right? Like I don't want
Right.
to throw any rocks in a glass house here, in the sense that we
Yes,
don't even have
and
ours
I
yet.
mean,
So
yes and no. You should always have a way that someone that finds a vulnerability in your product can report it to you. Call that a VDP program. Call that a dedicated like tech support ticket type that gets escalated to the security team. I don't care how you do it, but you need to have a way for people to report vulnerabilities to you. We've had a VDP for formally documented on the internet. Anybody is allowed to find vulnerabilities and disclose them and work with us to get them remediated. And we've been doing that. And our VDP, like there's this whole conversation about bug bounties versus VDPs.
sure.
Those are 2 different things. If you want to read more about them, we actually wrote a blog about it, so you could go read that blog. The most important thing is that you have a way for people that find vulnerabilities to disclose.
They know
them
how to
you.
interface with you, regardless
And
of whether it's internal or external.
yeah, and again, those VDP vulnerabilities for us, the only extra thing that a VDP requires from our part is communication with the researcher. Everything else just goes back into that vulnerability machine that
Yeah.
we built. It's
The one
just
we talked
another
about.
vulnerability that got found, and we just have to communicate with the researchers to do it. So
I do like that you
VDPs
added that component of saying our intention is to re-communicate with them and make them feel like they're part of this, right? Like, so I do appreciate
I mean,
that statement. Yeah.
our experience is that most of the people that disclose things to us that are disclosing real issues that aren't just
Yeah.
like the I call them
The
like the
hygienic,
$200 chasers.
non-leverageable things. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, like, oh, this you should have used a
Your
secure header here.
your well-known folder
Yeah.
contains information. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
find me. Uh, I found a header that should be secure. Give me $200. I'm like, go
yeah,
away. That's like we have carve outs in our VDP. Like there are things that you can disclose to us, but we just won't pay them a bounty
right.
because there's a lot of just bounty chasers. But we have paid bounties out to MSPs that have found vulnerabilities in our products that were important.
I know a few of them,
So
actually. So yeah,
so
I'm familiar.
we do take that seriously. I mean, I'll kind of crack the egg on my face. Like we're not great on the bug bounty side. Like we don't have
Right.
a formal bug bounty program, but we are going to be spinning one up this year. But I've always felt like our VDP has been so strong that like the bug bounty thing is more just for the people that are like, hey, I'm not in the Datto ecosystem. What is to incentivize me to come spend time and focus on your stuff? I think there's some validity to that. So we're gonna add that there, but like,
Well, it's like
just to
extra
be clear,
sensors for that information, right? Of what
yeah.
is vulnerable, what's the risk, what's our chance of occurrence,
But yeah,
bringing in other
we
pieces.
pay bounties out on the VDP program for anything that we find to be a high quality finding.
Well, I didn't mean to take us off topic. I did want
It's all
that
related.
context. Yeah, it's correlated. It's all part of the same engine, right, of putting things out. So we are at time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time that is watching, that stayed in and chatted. And Jason Slagle, I love you with all my heart. I appreciate you being here. And Martin and Shiva, awesome adding context. So thank you guys all so much. And Ryan, really appreciate your time. In life, the only thing we can do as humans is learn, right? And the only thing we can do is share learning so that we don't learn the same things over and over again. So I really appreciate you kind of walking into some of the pieces that came into, your efforts to succeed. And I'm not painting it as a hero or a failure or either of them, but the fact that you're thinking about it and talking about it is so very valuable to me in my heart. So I appreciate everything you do, brother. I look up to you. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for doing this. I mean, the more ways we can reach the community to kind of, and the community at large to share these messages, and I'm sharing my experience because I hope even if one person learns from it, that's huge. So
I want to talk about this real quick because we're over time, but Jason, you and I, buddy, we're going to roll this one to the ground. I told you that. That's in our, maybe even at a Right of Boom conference, something like that. I don't know. We'll figure it out.
yeah,
But,
Jason is
and then we've
passionate
got,
about NDAs.
he is, isn't he? I love him to death. I mean, but the point is, we're all trying to solve the same mission, right? Like, if we're really honest about it, and I think there should be less
Yeah.
infighting around these things and more drive towards the same common goal too. But Kevin Ireland, awesome session. Thank you, Kevin. I need that. That'll help me later in my imposter syndrome. Also, RC, thank you both. You're very welcome. Yeah, the struggle's real here, right? Being a practitioner in this space.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. We'll let everybody go.
Yeah, be well.